Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This will be an episode about a figure that is important in history, particularly the Reformation and particularly the formation of Canon, and was the only canon work written in the Reformation. So the only person who thoroughly looked at what canon should be and to be determined was Carlstadt, and he gave reasons extensively for it. But his canon put Jesus ahead of Paul. Therefore, he is the first person in the Reformation to systematically prove why that is so, and I'm going to show you the conclusions here today and why his short answers to why that was so. Again, his name is Andreas Bodenstein von Carlstadt. His family residence came from Carlstadt, a city in Germany, and he's often now just called Carlstadt himself. But his full legal name would be Andreas Bodenstein, but nobody knows it that way. So he's just called Carlstadt normally. And so I will follow that convention. And even though the city began with the letter K in English, we would not say that, or German. In English, it would be Karlstadt with a C because in Latin it's spelled with a C. So don't ask why, but that's why we spell it with a C. Anyway, here's the title of today's episode. Primary initial founder of Reformation in 1517, Carlstadt, in 1520, 3 years later, forcefully puts Paul below the Gospels of Jesus. And I've mentioned some of that in the past, but now I have new quotes because I decided to go in and dig in and do a full translation of the key passages. So we're going to share that with you today. The book that he wrote this in was in Latin, De Canonicis Scripturis Libellis, and so on. That's his name, and so on. And this work appeared in a work of 1847 called The Geschichte der Canons, meaning the writings about canon. And so this is just one of many different writings about canon in that work. Karlstadt lived or was born in 1486 and died in 1541. The way I came across this quote or section of quotes by Carlstadt is when I was reading up on Martin Luther in a book by Charles Beard. The book was entitled Martin Luther and the Reformation in Germany, and it was written in 1896. And this is the quote, and it has a footnote here to the text that we're going to be looking at today, part of one of the text paragraphs or sections. And this is what it says under Carlstadt's three classes of New Testament books, 401. But his most remarkable position, one which Luther would have fiercely contested, so one of Carlstadt's positions that Luther would have contested, one which opposes itself to the subsequent course of the Protestant thought in this matter. So subsequent Protestant thought after Carlstadt went against what Carlstadt recommended as canon. But again, not thought based on study, not based on researching what canon was in the early church, but instead by just simply using doctrine. That's what Luther did in his preface to the 1522 preface to the New Testament. He basically said, don't read the three synoptic gospels, just read John. That has some good stuff in it. And he said, but the epistles of Paul, that's where you should start and get the bone and marrow of everything you need to know. But this is the original canon decision. This is the original canon position of the Protestant Reformation, with all the correct positions that were properly recommended by Carlstadt, which included bringing back Sabbath, as you'll see. Why are we following Sunday? It makes no sense. He said we should be following Sabbath. Isaiah 56, 6-7, my friend, says the Gentiles, the sojourners, will not be welcome in my holy mountain unless they've kept from defiling my Sabbath and honored the Ten Commandments. That's what God Yahweh told Isaiah in Isaiah 56, 6-7. And that's what Jesus quoted when he said the house of God will be a house of God for all peoples, all nations. So there is a definite reason why Carlstadt went a different way than Luther goes later. Luther didn't know the gospel of salvation was right there in Isaiah for Gentiles. But anyway, I digress. So, but Carlstadt's most remarkable position, one which Luther would have fiercely contested, one which opposes itself to the subsequent course of Protestant thought in this matter, meaning Luther's Protestant thought, not the true Protestant thought of the founder. The true founder of the Reformation was this guy, as we'll get into in other episodes. But he had his tag-along was Luther, and Luther's going to get him exiled by going and appealing to Catholics to think that Carlstadt is too radical. He wants to get rid of communion and make it where people can hold it in their hands, and not treat it as the sanctified blood and body of Christ when you hold the communion wafer and You drink the wine. This is all, can't be held by people. Only priests can do this. So Luther was backtracking, going away from the Reformation, and this was Carlstadt moving forward. Anyway, his most remarkable position is that there are three classes or categories of New Testament books. The authority of the first is to be preferred to that of the second, the authority of the second to the third. On this ground, the word of Paul is not to be put on a level with that of Christ. And this is the Latin. And this is how I've been translating this in the past, and you'll see again today. But this basically says Paul is below the words of Jesus Christ. All right. And this is all in section 161 of Credner's edition of this work, Canonis Scripturis, in Latin. All right. So if you go to Geschichte des Kanons by Dr. Karl August Credner, you will find this work as a sub-article within it, De Canonicis Scripturis Libellis. And I will make available through a Airtable link. You can download this work from the description to this video. Now, I'm going to start beginning with section 156. So the key section is 161, but there's a lot of context that will help. And these are new quotes that I just translated today. Now, I'm not going to read the Latin, but those of you who like Latin, you can just screenshot this and you can double check me. Here's how I would translate it. It may be noted here that in my proposed canon, that's a bracketed text, meaning that's what he's talking about here, there are three new categories or classes, i.e., in place of all books on the same level. So what he means is these are new categories for all the books in the New Testament. And in the first place, we have reduced the works to be the evangelical lamps, that is the Gospels, or if you want to say more, the most clear light of the whole divine truth. So he's saying unequivocally, first category of reading is the evangelical lamps, the Gospels. Or if you want to even put it nicer and more importantly, the most clear light of the whole divine truth. So the whole divine truth is inside of these Gospels, and it's the most clear. Now here's paragraph 157, again in Latin, and I'm not going to translate it here. I'm going to translate it on the next page, but if anybody wants to double check against the original text, they can. I put a little screenshot of it there. Here we go. Translation. In the second order, meaning second level, second category, second class, should divide the apostolic letters, which on this side of the controversy we give to the apostles. And he means all the apostles. And he's including Paul as an apostle. Of which epistles, 13 for Paul, 1 to the Romans, give 1 to the Corinthians, 1 to the Galatians, 1 to the Ephesians, 1 to the Philippians, 1 to the Colossians, 2 to the Thessalonians, 2 to Timothy, 1 to Titus, to Philemon together. 1 for Peter, the first epistle. So there's 1st and 2nd Peter. He's saying 1st Peter is authoritative as Peter's work. 1 for John the Apostle, the first epistle of John. And he's therefore not agreeing that John 2nd and 3rd epistle of John are John's. Now he's going to then, I'm not going to go into this, but he puts James and Jude in the third order, the third class, okay? Because they're not apostles. So he's giving them a higher order as a group. But that also means he's not disputing that Paul is an apostle of some sort. But hold on to your horses. Here's where we get interesting about Paul. He's going to isolate Paul and say something more strongly about him than he does the 12. Page 409. And this is the Latin, so you can double check me on this. This is what that book by Beard was quoting, Carlstadt, section 161. This is 161, the entire text in Latin. And here it is in my screenshot of my capturing the words into the text for my PowerPoint here. And here's a translation. And you'll find this very interesting, I think. The inferior ones are always to be removed in favor of the earlier ones. Now, I'm going to actually just be translating this straight because later I'm going to add some little bracket questions and comments. So just listen to it as it would read straight off the page if you knew Latin and how you translate it. The inferior ones are always to be removed in favor of the earlier ones. For servants ought to obey their masters, just as the spirit of the apostle in the flesh was not equal to or greater than the master. By the way, that's a quote right out of John 13:16. The apostle is not greater equal to or greater than his master. So also the Pauline breast found in letters does not have as much authority as Christ has. For I would not allow a Christian to reject the latter, meaning Paul, without a note of fame, give him credit for being famous, for they are received as if, meaning Paul's writings are received as if they were divine documents, although the books of the first order are much more worthy, meaning the Gospels, and as such, in any case, are opposed to books that came in a later category. Okay, and I'm going to comment on that in a second, but I just want you to think about what he's saying there. He's saying the first order books always control over later books that are in any way opposing or different from the first order books. And that is absolutely how God dictated the rule of apostasy always to be applied. It's never a work that comes later that can supersede or change what came before. That is false. Okay, that is apostasy. That's why God put in the command, Deuteronomy 13, 1-10. That's why God said his law was eternal for all generations 27 times. Eternal or everlasting for all generations. As long as there were people on earth, this would be, and you didn't have giving and taking in marriage like will be true in the new millennium, that this was an era that God's law would always be applicable, whether you like it or not. It's not you to decide. God says it is so, and nobody, he's never going to send a prophet who will contradict him. And that's why he's putting this strong as he can, so you can get the idea that there's no way something that comes later can be superior to what was before. Inferior instead are those things that can't come later that are different than what came earlier. So the inferior ones are always to be removed in favor of the earlier ones. So he's telling you the principle of apostasy right there, but he's being a little gentle about it. But he's getting back to this principle of apostasy here also. Although the books of the first order are much more worthy, and as such, in any case, are opposed to books that came in a later category. So any contradictions that comes from a later book, later category, such as the second or third category he's going to talk about, they cannot contradict what's in the Gospels. And if they do, they're not to be credited. So I'm going to take those comments and put them in here a little more forcefully so you can see them. Section 161. The inferior ones are always to be removed in favor of the earlier ones, i.e., prior scripture forces removal from canon any later works that contradict it. I believe that's what he means. For servants ought to obey their masters, just as the spirit of the apostle in the flesh was not equal to or greater than the master, John 13:16. So also the Pauline breast found in letters does not have as much authority as Christ has. So whatever the breast, he means the heart. Also the heart of Paul found in his letters does not have as much authority as Christ has. That's just should be common sense, but that's what he's advancing here. For I would not allow a Christian to reject the latter, meaning Paul, without a mention of his fame, for they are received as if they were divine documents. He's talking about Paul's letters, okay? The breast found in letters of Paul, without mention of Paul's fame, for they are received as if they were divine documents. And he's already distancing that reality. He's saying, no, they're not actually divine. They are Paul writing. The true divine documents, the true documents inspired by God, 100% are those from Jesus, and he comes first, and nobody can come later who would supervene him. That's the rule of apostasy. Things that came later never supersede those things that came earlier. And the new covenant never said that the law would be taken away. The new covenant, Jeremiah 31, verse 31 and 33, clearly say that the only thing that changes in the new covenant is my Torah is put on their hearts. It's not that my Torah would be done away with. It would be made closer, more proximate to your hearts by memory, by things like what Jesus taught, for example, that bring to the bear the law in a memorable way through parables and other lessons. Let's continue. For I would not allow a Christian to reject the latter, that is Paul, without a mention of Paul's fame, for they are received, his letters, as if they were divine documents, although the books of the first order, meaning the Gospels, are much more worthy, and as such, in any case, are opposed to these books that came in later order, meaning anything of Paul or anybody else that would contravene Jesus's words would have to be disregarded. That is what he means by a later order, a later or subsequent category. In his list here, he's making 3 categories. So he's been calling it the word order each time, and I've been changing it just to say category, so you get a better idea. He's talking about first, second, and third order, but he means category in English. Okay, but in Latin we would say order. Okay, so I think that tells you the big picture of what he's talking about. Let's see how Carlstadt has done in the span of history. Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics is going to tell you the same principle, that whatever came earlier is more authoritative than anything that comes later, and it has to be tested. Whatever comes later always has to be consistent with what came before in the Bible, because anything else is apostasy and a crime. Page 83, Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics, Norman Geisler, famous Protestant authority in Christianity. The Bereans, who's that? Acts 17:11. They tested Paul's words against what came before. Now we're in the era of only the epistles to the Thessalonians. Okay, if there was anything to study that was in writing, this would have been it. The Bereans used this principle when they search the principle of apostasy. Search the scriptures to see whether Paul's teaching was true. If the preaching of the apostle did not accord with the teaching of the Old Testament canon, the law and prophets, it shouldn't even be called Old Testament, by the way, it should be called exactly what Jesus called it, the law and prophets. The new covenant did not mean the prior covenant goes away. In fact, the opposite. Again, I'm just going to repeat Jeremiah 31, verse 31 and 33. In verse 33, it clearly says the new covenant is my Torah, will be put on your hearts. God is referring back to the Torah in the law, right? And that's what is the whole nature of the new covenant. It'd be more intensely remembered by you, not forgotten by you or cast away. So the opposite of the new covenant is someone who teaches you to go away from God's law. And Carlstadt specifically was bringing that back, by the way, in the Ten Commandments, particularly the Sabbath. And he said that, and even though that's controversial today, it was great news for people. Oh my gosh, we need to know about this. And it's in Isaiah 56:67, as I've said earlier. I just want to show you something here. Is what if we took the words of Jeremiah and we read them against an apostate teaching against the Torah, such as in Hebrews 8:13? Listen to this, that does away with all of the law and the prophets in one fell swoop. Verse 13, in that he says, a new covenant he has made the first old. Now that which decays and waxes old is ready to vanish away. And as it proceeds, he basically says it has to vanish away. And if we don't let it die, if the testator still lives, then there's no New Testament. So he makes it all basically one has to supersede the other. It won't work. But that's the opposite of what God's law always said. It's eternal for all generations. Jesus says the law will not go away, and the heavens and earth will go away until one jot or tittle will ever fall from the law. So that it's permanent until generations cease on earth, just as it says in the law itself, that it's eternal or everlasting for all generations. Here's what it says in Jeremiah 31:33. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my law, my Torah, in their inward parts, and I will write it in their heart. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. It doesn't say they're going to live by the Spirit without the letter of the law. It says my law will now be written in their inward parts. I will write it in their heart. It's something that you will remember because it's written in your heart. It's not that it's just you just decide what feels spiritually good to you. It's what God said before, and he's now going to put it closer into your heart. And that's what Jesus' whole role was, to bring the law more approximately to your heart using parables and witty sayings. So if we use Carlstadt's approach and look at the Bible itself, we come to the same conclusion. Let's look at Exodus 31:16-17. Now, this is talking about the Sabbath for the people of Israel, okay? But again, Isaiah 56:6-7 talks about the Sabbath has to be obeyed by the Gentiles who want to enter my holy mountain. That's the new millennium. But just let's listen to it, because Paul actually says there's no more Jew or Gentile, and he himself is no longer under the law in 1 Corinthians 9. He'll say that, I'll act like I'm under the law, even though I'm not under the law. So he believes the law no longer applies even to a Jewish person. So let's continue. Verse 16, therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout the time period until a new covenant takes it away. No, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual temporary covenant. No, a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. Well, oh, wow, that's not a short time. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Nothing's going to change. And if it does, if anybody tries to do that, that's called apostasy. And how many times does it say eternal for all generations? You can just look them all up here. And next, I just want to show you the disdain that Carlstadt has for Pauline doctrine, and Paul himself is obvious when you realize he's going to drop Acts. Now he's dropping Acts as even reading material necessary for anyone. And because I think a lot of people read it and they think it's about an endorsement of Paul, when instead it's really an appellate defense that Luke is writing on behalf of the church, the apostolic church, to fight Nero ruling against Paul, and then that reverberating and boomeranging on the church itself, and we could end up being, abolished or made illegal to operate. So they had Lucius, who was a Latin speaker who also knew Greek, and he wrote the book of Acts as a defense. And there's a book called In Defense of Paul by Mr. Mauck, written in 2001, that makes a perfect case, explains it, and uses historical evidence that this was the whole original meaning of the book of Acts. And that's indeed what it is. So it's not really meant for us Christians. In fact, it says things that are bizarre that we would have to say there's no way that Luke would ever want us to believe what Paul is saying there. For example, Paul says God does not dwell in temples made of human hands, when Jesus says clearly the temple, don't swear by the temple where God dwells, which is made by human hands. So they're totally opposite each other. But more importantly, everybody knows God dwells in the temple at Jerusalem. That's the whole point of having a temple. It's for him to dwell there. And then when the temple fell in 70 AD, the Roman historian Tacitus recorded that the voice spoke as it left, we are departing now, and so on and so forth. So this was a miracle that even the pagans had memory of the God Yahweh leaving at that time. But anyway, let's just take a look at what Carlstadt does here and how this is handled, and then how Pauline Christians try to finagle around this. And I'll just show you. Libri Prime means the first category is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. No Acts at the end of that, right? Then category second are all these epistles, okay? There is nothing about the book of Acts here. Then we get to the next third level, and that's Hebrews, James, Jacobi, Petri, and so forth and so forth. Well, it's obvious that even the editor of this book here, Bleak, the Introduction to the New Testament, he says in the Latin work, the Acts of the Apostles, is meaning the book of Carlstadt, the Acts of Apostles is not named in the classification. And then he says this: Carlstadt reckoned it with the Gospel of St. Luke, as appears in page 396. And he cites Credner of 396. Well, let's go take a look at Credner in 396. Does it actually say what this Bleak character says? The answer is no. Acta Apostolorum sicut viderat composuat evangelio vero sicut odierat scripsit says this: he composed the Acts of the Apostles as he had seen, and wrote the Gospel as he indeed had heard. It's not saying he includes it in any of the three categories. It just says he wrote the Acts of Apostles. But the Gospel is totally different. That's the light of the evangelism, of the Evangel. So this is totally, what is going on here, my friends? People want to try to explain, he did not see anything wrong with the book of Acts. Yes, there's something wrong with the book of Acts. It can be misunderstood by people who are uneducated to think this is about a defense of Paul, because it mentions him 174 times. And it mentions Jesus about 10 or 11 times. It mentions Peter 4 or 5 times. So Paul's getting all this attention. Well, it has to be, because the account of his getting in trouble at the temple when his friend Trophimus violates the temple, defiles the temple. Paul is being accused by the Jews of Asia there that he has brought in a Gentile who's defiled the temple is one of the 4 charges they brought against him. And Paul, he says, well, I wasn't with him when he defiled the temple. Trophimus went into cross the middle wall of separation at the temple. I wasn't there. I was in a ceremonial bath. All of this gets lost, and you don't have any idea, if it isn't pointed out to you, what this central fact is in Acts 21 about that charge. And that's what this whole case, and why this is a appellate brief for Nero, and Nero's judge named Theophilus, magistrate assistant judge, he's the one who's reading this stuff, and it's not meant for us. Christians would never, ever believe what Paul said to Luke about when he's talking to the people, the pagans of Athens. He says to them, to try to sway them to, quote, the unknown God, he says, well, God does not live in temples made of human hands. That's how he's going to identify it. But you want to know something? That's only true of pagan gods. The pagan gods live on Mount Olympus. They never actually dwell in their temples. Did you know that? They visit and they eat and they share fellowship, and then they depart and they go back to Mount Olympus. That's how it works with pagan land. So that statement Paul quotes is out of paganism, and yet he's endorsing it as true. And it was central to the defense of that trial coming up, because if God did actually dwell, Yahweh actually dwells in the temple of Jerusalem, then a uncircumcised Gentile like Trophimus entering would violate the temple and create a cause of an abomination. Under Ezekiel, God, Yahweh told Ezekiel, if that happens, I will destroy my own temple if you let that happen. If a Gentile comes in uncircumcised, he has to be circumcised both in heart and flesh. And if he comes in uncircumcised in flesh, that's an abomination. I will destroy my temple. So that's why Luke could not have intended us to believe that, because we know that's not true. You cannot go into the temple uh, at all, because Yahweh dwells there, and it's a holy place. So you cannot go past that middle wall of separation in uncircumcised state, and that was considered an unclean state for a Gentile to enter in that way. And it was clear in all the law and the prophets. And again, you can see it's still going on in Acts 21. And so Luke is not trying to convince us that God does not dwell in temples made of human hands. That is exactly what he wants the Romans to hear, coming out of a Roman poet saying the same thing. Okay, he says, even as your prophets say, that the Lord does not dwell in temples made of human hands. So Paul is affirming something that pagans will believe. And Luke needs that to try to win this case, because Nero will resonate with those pagan thoughts. But for us, the book of Acts cannot possibly be intended for us, because Luke does not want us to believe something false. So that's important. And that's something I think Carlstadt saw through, that this book was not meant for us in the sense of proving Paul is valid. It's meant to prove Paul is invalid. And whatever he's saying here is apostasy, one over the top stuff. But it also tells us that the 12 apostles in Acts 21 are investigating whether Paul's an apostate, and that could be important on appeal if Nero had ruled against Paul, but he actually ruled in favor of Paul in this trial, just so you know, both Eusebius and Jerome mention. And then people claim he was later killed in a subsequent trial with Nero, but there's no proof of that. And the opposite is true in 1 Clement chapter 5, found again in the Alexandrinus Bible from the 400s. Stuck in the back was this epistle to First Clement, that had been lost for centuries. But anyway, the point is this: Carlstadt also eliminated the book of Acts, and that's another subtle, clear, obvious point. He's not going to fall into the misleading use of Acts and tell people you need to read this, because most people, being uneducated, don't know how to read what I told you. You have to read it from the context of a trial brief, and then it all makes sense why you're reading all of this stuff. And Paul does come out looking as good as possible, and he teaches a gospel of works-worthy repentance in Acts 26. He says in Acts 23 he believes in all the law and prophets. I believe in all the law and prophets, all that has been written according to the law and prophets. So he clearly is endorsing the law. He's clearly teaching a different gospel of works-worthy repentance in Acts 26, and recording and telling that under oath to Festus and King Agrippa there. Why is he doing that? Well, that's a whole nother question outside of this context of what Carlstadt's dealing with. But should the book of Acts be read by Christians in the sense of this is something you should take and not understand its context, what its purpose was for? And it actually reveals a lot about Paul and his invalidity. But Luke wasn't worried about Paul's invalidity. He was worried about the church itself not being blamed for Paul's apostasy, not being blamed if Trophimus violated the temple, went through the middle wall separation, as the Jews of Asia charged in Acts 21. And, they wanted to put forth Paul's alibi. Yeah, sure. Tell Luke, be sure to include his alibi. He was not there with them. He was in the ceremonial bath. Please let them know this guy did not instigate this on our behalf, for sure. But there was always that possibility that the 12 could be blamed, and James could be blamed for all of what Paul did or his friend did at the temple. And so to avoid that, they had this second layer of protection, which is Acts 21, in that section where they charge Paul, we've heard rumors that you're guilty of apostasy, and you have to prove that's not true. And here's what you need to do to prove you're not an apostate. And James tells Paul you have to take a Nazirite vow, and Paul does exactly that. And fulfilling what James said would prove to everyone else that these rumors that you're apostate against the Mosaic law and you say it doesn't apply, everyone's going to learn that's not true. And Paul does exactly what he's told to do by James, the Bishop of Jerusalem. And that it was not for our benefit, my friends, although we should look at it carefully. It was to tell the Romans, if you find this guy Paul did something wrong, it's not because we authorized him to. We told him you have to be law compliant, obedient, even before he went into the temple. And his friend Trophimus from Ephesus escaped his influence and oversight, and Trophimus went, entered in the temple in an uncircumcised state. Now, if we diverge in the future and try to create a new canon, and we put Acts where it belongs, like I just showed you, now we have to decide what to really do with James, Jude, Peter, and John. And instead of segmenting this between, quote, the alleged apostles and give Paul even that honor, because he's not mentioned in the 12 apostles and the book of Revelation doesn't put him there, we need to put instead these books in this order. And this was the original order: James, Jude, Peter, and John. And then Paul came, and then the book of Revelation. So this is in Athanasius' letter of 365 AD, letter 39. This is the oldest order that we can find, okay, that you can date, okay? And this is where he's talking about the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Afterward, the Acts of the Apostles. Now that's where Carlstadt has a good point. Take that out. Then the epistles that are called Catholic, that is James 1, Peter 2, John 3, and after these, one of Jude. And I agree with that. And I believe we need 2 Peter, because clearly Peter says there that these people who are just reading, obviously, Paul's writings that had no anti-law position in them because of what Peter says in verse 17. That's what's key. You got to look at verse 17. Peter says these people had distorted Paul to say that Paul was teaching against the written law. But there was, even though Paul speaks some things that are nonsensical, that according to Paul, Peter's own words, however, he said there was nothing he could see in them, in these writings, that were ethesmos, meaning anti-written law. That means he hadn't seen Paul's later writings that are clearly anti-written law. The Sabbath is up to you. You did pick it whichever day you want. Romans, Colossians, the ordinances have been done away. That's Ephesians, all these other things. These were unknown to Peter in 2 Peter. So we need to keep 2 Peter, but then give people the historical context and put in the correct order. And that means that Paul doesn't come before James, Jude. He comes after. So you always want to have what's earlier show its superiority to what comes later. And James and Jude, Peter and John are superior to Paul, and they correct him. And that's another thing we don't know or didn't know. The Council of Hippo of 393 was led by Augustine. So that's a city in Algeria, Hippo, Algeria. And that's allegedly the first time the canon we're reading today was put together. But Augustine of Hippo himself had just will write a book in that time period around 400 AD that says that the works of James, Jude, Peter, and John were all assembled to prove the invalidity of Paul's doctrine of faith alone. That's Augustine saying that, and he's the author of the Council of Hippo, which made up the first canon. So why would he have? What would he have intended? And so we don't really know the order he had agreed upon at that time. But this order, earliest order that was documented in 365, which was a couple decades earlier than 393, Hippo, is an order that makes sense. You want to make the more authoritative sources come first, so you can then know to correct what comes last. And that's the whole purpose of the canon, the way it was assembled in the 300s, to reflect Augustine's idea that these works, James, Jude, Peter, and John, were to correct Paul, and therefore to understand even what these people are writing about. In other words, James and Jude, for example, are clearly talking against Paul's doctrines. Somebody teaching grace is a license for immorality, that's Jude. It's a criticism. You may not agree with it. You may think Paul defended himself well. Well, then go look up Paul's response. James, James 2:24, the justification is by works and not by faith alone. That's clearly refuting Romans chapters 3 and 4, right? So but without this context, you cannot understand what you're even reading and why it's put in this order. So this order helps you see Paul's not included because he's so authoritative. It's because you can't understand what James, Jude, and Peter are responding to until you see Paul later. Okay, so you have to have these up front and educate you, and then you can come and read Paul later. So Carlstadt Canon is a very good outline of where to go in the future. All right, God bless everyone. Take care. Ciao. Bye.